Record. All right.
Okay, it's gone to you now.
Okay. One moment, Zoomers. Oh wait, did I? Yeah. One moment, Zoomers. We'll be right back with the handout. Okay. Oh.
While that's being arranged, only two things. Sandra was talking about labels. Where is Sandra? Labels, and made me think as I was going to the men's room that the philosophy department is now in a big struggle about what to label the bathrooms. Do you know about that? I don't know whether has that been decided yet. Labeling is very important.
I think there's a bathroom committee.
This committee. All right, so it's interesting to think of Quine as being sandwiched in between two Lewises. So this is about the relationship between Quine and David Lewis. You know, Quine was Lewis's dissertation advisor, as we all know. And despite this close connection, it's widely believed, at least in some parts of the philosophy community, though I know not by some people here, that their views are just enormously different. The vast chasm between the two of them. Yeah, no, Quine was known as an enemy of modality, a lover of ontological desert ants, desert landscapes. He argued that quantified modal logic is incoherent, that it leads to Aristotelian essentialism or worse, you can imagine anything worse. And most importantly, that philosophy has no need of metaphysical necessity to make sense of science or anything else. Metaphysical necessity to make sense of science or anything else. He's also well known for his distaste of ontologies that posit fictional entities, propositions, properties, and intentions. He rejected not only metaphysical necessity and possibility, but also the analytic synthetic distinction and the a priori and posteriori distinctions. In contrast, Lewis accepted all these distinctions and developed accounts of metaphysical necessity, nomological necessity, chances, counterfactuals, causation, properties, propositions, and intentions. Things that Quine had much to do with. And although he loved the Australian desert, Lewis's ontology is not sparse, as it includes infinitely many causally isolated concrete possible worlds. He said this ontology of concrete possible worlds induced in his critics, what did he say? Induced in his critics incredulous stare. One could only imagine the expression on Quine's face if he ever looked at it. At first, then, there seems to be a vast chasm separating Quine and Lewis's philosophies. But they also agreed on a lot. Both were empiricists, physicalists, extensionalists, anti-essentialists, structuralists, and I think Humeans as well. Both endorsed naturalizing metaphysics and epistemology, and both were, in my view, great philosophical stylists. Recently, Frederica Jansen-Lorette, incidentally, I'm only giving this talk. I made up the conference, but I wasn't going to give a talk. She was going to give the talk, so I'm just replacing her because she was sick. And she has very interesting papers. I highly recommend her papers on Quine and Lewis, the relationships. And Fraser McBride, the two of them have written papers together, and they've observed that Lewis's views about Humeanism and modality were greatly influenced by Quine. And Quine, especially the latter Quine, was not as anti-metaphysical as he's often understood to be. Sander Weger has emphasized that Quine came to accept science needs some modal distinctions, in particular laws, chances, dispositions, and to some extent counterfactuals of causation. And Quine even accepted possible worlds, properly understood. But he certainly disagreed with Lewis about metaphysical necessity and possibility. Quine thought that these notions, like the analytic synthetic distinction and the a priori posteriori distinction, have no place in philosophy. they belong in the dustbin of philosophy. Quine was more concerned with the epistemology of science than with its metaphysics. So he didn't address the metaphysical underpinnings of laws, chances, and causation. Lewis, on the other hand, was a metaphysician of science as well as epistemology. He developed metaphysical accounts of nomological modalities, laws, chances, counterfactuals, rest. The most important place where he differed from Quine is that Lewis thought that metaphysical necessity and possibility are needed to make sense of various philosophical and scientific notions. Lewis also thought that an account of metaphysical necessity and possibility involves an ontology of concrete, causally separated possible worlds, of course, and that accepting this ontology allowed philosophers to enter a philosophical paradise, which contained properties explained in terms of propositions, meanings, intentions, a lot else. Quine thought of this not as a paradise, but as a hell, and creatures of darkness. Lewis was led to his ontology of concrete possible worlds because he followed Quine in being an extensionalist. His account of metaphysical possibility is that a sentence A is possibly true, just in case there's at least one possible world in which A is true. According to Quine's criterion of ontological commitment, the B is to be the value of a quantifiable variable. Since Lewis's account of quantifies over possible worlds, it is committed to them. And Lewis thought that all possible worlds, including the actual world, must be alike for this to be a genuine reduction, which is what he was doing. And since the actual world is a concrete space-time, he concluded that they all are concrete. And if so, they must be closely separated from each other. Those philosophers who found possible worlds useful, as many of us do, but didn't like this vast ontology of concrete worlds, viewed them rather as sets of propositions, stories, so-called ersatz worlds. But this wouldn't be a reduction, since only the stories that are possibly true would qualify as worlds. And of course, Quine didn't go for that either. Most significantly, like Quine was Humean, like Lewis, when it comes to nomological modalities. One way to express this Humean commitment, for Lewis at any rate, is that laws, counterfactuals, statements about probabilities and dispositions are equivalent to or analyzable in terms of propositions about complicated patterns of non-nomological property instantiations. This is a view that Lewis held. And I think Quine would, if he went into the idea of explaining or reducing or analyzing each question, would go for that. In other words, I think Quine would think in the world, there are atoms in the void, whatever they're doing, and so on. We don't need further ontology in order to deal with the nomological modalities. On Lewis's view, what this means is that when it comes to counterfactuals and other nomological modalities, possible worlds are really just a way station to getting at their actual truth makers, which is the Lewis distribution of fundamental properties. Second, if this is the case, concrete worlds don't have to be taken seriously as truth makers or propositions about nomological modalities. And of course, Lewis and others also employ possible worlds in formulating formal semantics and logics for nomological modalities, all modalities. And for these uses, worlds also need not be concrete possibility of found in the plurality of worlds. Ersatz worlds can do this work pretty well. But as I mentioned, Lewis did not agree with Quine about metaphysical necessity, since he, but not Quine, took it very seriously. Well, metaphysicians, and in the Rutgers department is you throw anything and you'll get a metaphysician. The Rutgers department. But they're all doing everything else. In fact, I was assigned to teach the metaphysics course 2 years ago, undergraduate course, but I don't think that's it. They all have benefits. So metaphysicians love metaphysical necessity. They use it to characterize metaphysical fundamentality, centrality, grounding, intrinsic, extrinsic,
essentialism, supervenience, and much, much else. But whether it's needed in science, really, or in philosophy of science, is an open question for me. Now, understand what I'm saying? I'm not saying asking whether modality is needed, I'm asking whether metaphysical necessity and possibility. Philosophy of science. Well, this is a really interesting question, and maybe we can talk about it, but it's not really the topic of my paper, which I'll get to in just 1 second, but one that's closely related to it. Well, both Quine and Lewis, what we call naturalists, they call themselves naturalists, they differed in their treatment of naturalists and in particular of natural properties. For Quine, natural is an honorific earned by a predicate or property of a kind of individual in virtue of its role in science. Classification into natural kinds is done to aid scientific theorizing. There's nothing more metaphysical about it. Being an electron for Quine is a natural property because it plays a certain role in electromagnetic theory, a standard model in quantum mechanics, and the fact that these theories are true or close enough to being true. Lewis, I think, understands naturally different. For him, it refers to a fundamental metaphysical property of properties. He makes it clear that it is not analyzable or in terms of or reducible to anything else. He says this very explicitly. His view is that every set of possible entities is a property, but only a very select few are what he calls perfectly natural. Other properties are more or less natural, depending on how close their definitions are to perfectly natural properties. Definitions in a certain language, that is. Lewis employs naturalness in his account of possible worlds, laws, causation, counterparts, events, similarity, induction, and reference. It is one of his main contributions to philosophy, and it is influenced and is employed by many subsequent metaphysicians. The notion of naturalness is really central and very important to Lewis and many afterwards. What I'm going to do is what you might call a deconstruction of the notion of naturalness. Now, frankly, I just thought of describing it that way, and I don't really know what deconstruction means, but I might discover this was Lewis and Quine agree. Lewis and Quine both agree with each other that green is more natural than blue, and we cannot discover which properties are natural a priori, but it's up to science. So one may wonder how different their views really are. I think there's a big difference between them. And I actually came to the way I'm going to describe the difference between them because of conversing with someone who's in the room here, Veronica, in fact. I don't know whether she put it this way or I thought of it this way. One way to bring out the difference is by recalling Plato's Euthyphro, where Socrates asked, is an act pious in virtue of the gods loving it, or do the gods love it in virtue of its being pious? I see Quine as claiming that what makes a property natural is that it is loved by science, or rather that it satisfies the theory goals that science loves. On the other hand, Lewis's view is that science loves or ought to love a property in virtue of its being natural. It makes sense, at least the way I'm trying to make it. I think there's really a big difference here now. So, I think neither Quine nor Lewis may have liked this way of marking the difference that much, because they both tended to avoid hyper-intentional notions like in virtue of. But I think there are other ways of bringing out the distinction. Quine doesn't think of predicates as referring to properties, so he uses natural to refer to a kind of predicate, not a kind of property. For him, as I said before, is what makes a predicate a natural kind predicate is the role it plays in a scientific theory. In contrast, as I said before, Lewis' natural is a primitive referring to a property of properties. It is a property possessed by some properties, whether or not they are actually instantiated. And in fact, he calls properties whose instantiation will violate the laws of any world, let's say for the actual world, alien to that world. Now, it's difficult to give an example of an alien perfectly natural property. I didn't say this before, maybe I should say it right now. The perfectly natural ones, those are really the elite properties. The other natural properties are more or less natural, depending on how they're connected to perfectly natural properties. So it's difficult to give an example of one, but we can imagine that in some worlds, there are fundamental particles, let's say, or something like particles, with properties that violate the laws of our world. then they would be alien. Perfectly natural to that world, maybe. But, Lewis's perfectly natural properties are closely connected to possible worlds, and so to metaphysical necessity and possibility. That's why I think that social naturalness is connected to the introduction to necessity and possibility. On Lewis's account, every possible world is something like a space-time arena or some such structure from which space-time emerges, decorated with instantiations of perfectly natural properties. He holds that perfectly natural properties are what he calls categorical. This means that their instantiations of disjoint space-time regions are metaphysically independent from one another. Lewis usually talks about perfectly natural properties being instantiated in points, and in fact, he may think that all there aren't any concrete individuals except space-time points. He's a little equivocal at this point, instantiating perfectly natural properties. Okay, so to say they're categorical means that their instantiations in disjoint space-time regions are metaphysically independent of each other. And this is exactly why his ontology is called Jungian, I think. Metaphysically speaking, it makes everything loose and separate, but just metaphysically. This enables Lewis to hold that every mathematically possible combination of instantiations of perfectly natural properties and relations in a space-time constitutes a possible world. So this gives him a way of reducing possible worlds, begins the reduction of possible worlds to the notion of perfectly natural properties. It would finish the reduction if he also held that every possible world is constituted by a distribution of instantiations of perfectly natural properties and relations. If so, he really held that. And I don't know any place, maybe Helen knows the literature better than me, whether he ever embraces that, says that. But if he held that, then fundamental dispositions and fundamental laws, so to say, involving life, are ruled out by his account as impossible, because they are not categorical and they won't appear in any possible world. Lewis observes natural properties as categorical. They can be known only by their contingent nomological closely roles. This means that their intrinsic natures, what he calls a property's quiddity, is unknowable. It follows that if W is a possible world, there are double dangle worlds W star, exactly like W, except that where one perfectly natural property is instantiated in W, a different perfectly natural property is instantiated at the corresponding points in W star. The worlds would be distinct, but structurally identical. We can know them. We can know which world, we couldn't know which world we're in. So Lewis's view is a kind of what we might call structuralism, or epistemic structuralism. Quine is not committed to alien properties or to scientifically fundamental properties being categorical, or for that matter, he's certainly not committed to Lewis's account of concrete possible worlds, or for that matter, the notions of metaphysical possibility and quiddity. The distinction between category and non-categorical for scientific properties, fundamental scientific properties, since it involves metaphysical necessity, would make no sense for Quine. But Fraser McBride and Frederick Jensen Loret argue that Quine is also an epistemic structuralist, since he thinks that all we can know about the world is its structure. So I think that's an interesting connection between Quine and Lewis, that they're both these types of structuralists. They're epistemic structuralists. Now, some people who call themselves structuralists nowadays, David Wallace might be an example, but I'm not sure I really understand him. They want to go further, think that all there is in the world is structure. Fortunately, we don't have time to talk about that. One of the most important uses Lewis makes, and now we're getting to the heart. One of the most important uses Lewis makes of perfectly natural properties is in his account of laws, chances, counterfactuals, and causation. On that account, what he calls the Jungian mosaic consists of the instantiation of perfectly natural properties throughout all of the actual space-time. And lawful generalizations are certain generalizations entailed by the scientifically optimal systematization of this Humean mosaic. This is his Humean account of the laws of nature. But laws are certain generalizations held by the scientifically optimal systematization of the Humean mosaic, the instantiation of the perfectly natural properties throughout all of space and time. So it's a very, ambitious, incredible view. I mean, it's I would say, a view from outside the ship of science. Come to that. The interesting thing about this view is that it makes use of this idea of systematization in his account of laws. That's what makes something a law, is its role in the systematization. Because of what makes for an optimal scientific systematization, Lewis just says about that is that it's a systematization that prioritizes certain things like informational content and simplicity, and then fit when you add chance to the picture. But he doesn't say that much about these notions, or what he does say is not something you really want to hold. I think the right way to think about it, maybe bringing him a little bit closer to Quine, is that you look to science and see what science prioritizes in coming up with scientific theories that are worthy of being theories of the world. Of course, they also have to pass empirical tests as well. Okay. So Quine himself doesn't give any metaphysical accounts of laws and chances. But presumably he would agree with Reichenbach and with Lewis that not every true generalization is lawful. He wouldn't go along with accounts like Armstrong's or Maudlin's of birds, I think. We'll argue about this later. That what makes a generalization lawful involves some kind of fundamental necessity, some kind of necessity that's not explainable in terms of other things. Nor would Quine go along with propensity accounts of chances like Popper's, since that also involves some sort of fundamental modality. If Quine were to have now we're speculating here. If Quine were to have a metaphysical account of nomological modalities, I think they would be Jungian, like Lewis's. But how could they be? Lewis's account involves perfectly natural properties. That's what you get to systematize. And a Quinean account cannot depend on perfectly natural properties, since, as I said, these involve metaphysical modalities. So what would a Quinean Jungian account of laws be? The core idea of Lewis's account is that laws systematize and unify rather than they be governed for necessity. According to the best systems account of laws, they systematize the distribution of perfectly natural properties. But if there's not perfectly natural properties around, as Quine holds, what is there to systematize? Well, I think Quine's epistemology of science gives an answer to this question. Recall that Quine held that science begins in the middle, as was emphasized earlier, with the investigation of what we're given, where we started. I don't know how far back to go, but we could just say this: science begins with the investigation of certain macroscopic phenomena, the motions, let's say, of planets, pendula, projectiles, the dissolving of salt, the melting of ice, the diffusion of gas, and so on. And what science does is it systematizes these by seeing the connections between them, and often by adding further ontology. For example, atoms, molecules, because this helps in the systematization. I mean, I don't have to go into details, but you can see how by having the idea that gases and liquids and solids like ice are made up out of atoms helps us systematize, see what the connection is between them. And if we have laws governing, I use that word, but there's a deflationary way of understanding it. Laws systematizing atoms and molecules, then we can come up with really good accounts systematizing the behavior of ice and gases and so on. We can come up with statistical mechanics, thermodynamics. Well, scientists work from within as their eye. It says to develop better, deeper systemizations of the macroscopic truths with which science begins, and those added to aid in that systematization. We can imagine Loewer Quine did an idealization of this process, culminating the system, which is much like what Steven Weinberg called in a book of 25 years ago. It's also looks out of date. You can get it in Manger, actually. I think what's the name of this book? I don't remember the name of the book. But anyway, he called this the theory of everything. What's the name of this book? Dreams of a Final Theory. Thanks. Well, it was a dream. Maybe it'll come true. This is a theory that is fundamental ontology and ideally an ideology that systematizes the macroscopic phenomena with which science begins with other macroscopic phenomena that's added along the way as science grows, and everything that's also added along the way. For it to be a theory of everything, the distribution of instantiations of fundamental scientific properties, what it says is fundamental scientific properties and quantities, must also suffice as supervening space for all macroscopic truths and everything else along the way. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a theory of everything. Now, this dream, I think the person who had this dream first, well, maybe it wasn't first, but the place where I spent first is in Descartes. Descartes clearly had this dream. When people talk about Descartes' dream, they usually talk about something else. But I think this is the real Descartes. Now, I think this dream would have died if 60 or 65 years later, Newton didn't come along and nearly almost made the dream come true. Because people thought for a long time they just came up with something close to what Weinberg thought was everything. Well, Newton wasn't right, and we learned that. Needed additions of magnetic theory, needed statistical mechanics to see how it applies to the macroscopic world, really, and so on. And in the 20th century, we discovered it needed emendations and how it thought about space-time emendations that's fundamental ontology of quantum mechanics. And there's not a theory of everything yet, as Weinberg emphasized in his book. And people have been going on and on since then, trying to come up with some sort of theory of everything. But they have come up with something pretty close. And you might, those of you who looked at Sean Carroll, I don't remember the name of his book either, but he describes something he calls the core theory, which he writes it down as a long equation, which you kind of look at it and say, I'm not even going to bother to understand this equation because it's just stuff like that. But if you spend a little attention and learn a little bit of quantum field theory and so on, you see what it's talking about. And a little general relativity, you see what it's talking about. But of course, it's not a theory of everything. This doesn't have a theory of gravity. But maybe some people think that if this theory of everything is just around the corner, or it's not around that corner, it's down the block, or not down that block. Well, I don't know where. Anyway, but maybe this is lovely. The reason I'm going on about this, I mean, so much in this weekend, my paper, is that this is now going to be the heart of my theory of what laws are, taking up from Lewis. Is that what laws are, and I give this to a name, I call it the package deal account of laws. What laws are certain generalizations entailed by the theory of everything of our world, if there is a theory of everything of our world. If there's not, that it's what's entailed by a theory, maybe the core theory, that comes the closest to being a theory of everything. There might be more than one such theory. If so, then laws are either what's in common among all of them, as Lewis holds, or it might be something that we want to relativize. Okay, I've told you now what the package deal account of laws are. Now, if I had time, I would spend the rest of my talk defending package deal account and Union account against it and show you why it's so much better than Lewis' account. So let me just say, without reading my paper now. You see, this account replaces Lewis' perfectly natural properties. It's not in this account at all. This account has no use the metaphysical necessity. Now, I'm not saying, but it doesn't, it's not an argument against the being metaphysical necessity, but it doesn't make use of the notion of metaphysical necessity or the notion of categorical properties. In fact, the fundamental scientific properties in this account, nothing is said about whether they're categorical or not categorical. Maybe the distinction doesn't make any sense at the level of fundamental properties. Of course, at the level of higher level properties, the nomological modalities can come in, and then it can make a distinction between which properties are what they are in virtue of satisfying certain lawful metrics. But you have the notion of law or already. Okay. I think I've explained to you this package deal account now well enough, and it can come up in discussion a little bit more. I just published a book. It took me till I'm about to retire to write a book of my own, but it's now out. It's called, has a great title. Not as good as Weinberg's, I admit, but maybe it's as good. It's called What Breathes Fire into the Equations. Now, of course, I stole that from Steve Hawking, but it's a pretty good title. So if you're intrigued by the package deal account, you can buy an account, or you can beg me to send you a PTA. Yes. Okay. Okay. I think I've explained it well enough. Well, I think it's a great improvement over Lewis's PSA because it doesn't have perfectly natural properties. I also think it's superior to non-human council laws, but I'm not going to have any time. Don't want to end in 10 minutes to give my arguments about why this is much better than non-human council, like Eddie and Shelley's constrained view laws, or Tim Maudlin's governing account laws, or Armstrong's. What's called Armstrong? Armstrong, in his account, he has an account in which properties are connected by a relation he calls contingent necessitation. When I ran across that, I thought, contingent necessitation. Okay, but I think this is much better than those, and much better than the kind of account you get from Powers accounts like Birds and Ellis, and other people have views like that. But I'm not going to get into why that's so. Anybody who wants to talk to me, you start a conversation with me at this conference, you won't be able to shut me up, actually. Okay. But what I do think, and I do want to say this, is that it gets rid of perfectly natural properties while preserving the core idea of Lewis's account of laws, that laws systematize. What makes laws is that they systematize. Parenthetically, I investigated a bit the history of the concept of laws. I read everything that's written about the history of the concept of laws. I'm no historian, but Sander is. Maybe he's investigated this a bit, but it has been investigated, but no historian, maybe Sanders, the person to do it, has written a history of the concept of laws of nature. I find that astonishing. There are good histories of chance and probability, and there are good papers about the history of the concept of laws, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, and a little bit written about what happened in the 19th century, but no one has written a whole comprehensive history. If I were a historian, younger, that's what I would do. It's a very, very interesting topic to work on. I've gotten rid of perfectly natural properties while preserving the idea that what laws do is they systematize. When studying the history, I discovered that in the original idea of laws of nature that Descartes was thinking about, laws are thought of as principles that describe how God governs motion. God is responsible for all motion. Descartes, you too, for that matter. And they also systematized, and they were mathematical. Why is that? Well, Descartes thought it was like that because Descartes was a mathematician. So God must be a mathematician too. So okay, but I got Lewis preserved this idea by having Humean mosaic with perfectly natural properties. I've gotten rid of perfectly natural properties. So one might say, Dennett permitting, that what my package deal account is a way of quining Lewis's perfectly natural properties. Everybody get that? No Lewis's paper quining Incidentally, when I gave this talk as the Lewis lecture at Princeton, and my original title was Quine Lewis. And then I realized that's a terrible title for how you talk about Lewis. So I changed the title. And it was bad. Okay, I'm not going to go. I'm going to come to the end of the talk now instead of going over all the ways in which it's better. Well, maybe I'll talk about this first. But I think I have time to do it. One big worry that someone might have about Lewis's account and about my package deal account is something that Lewis brought up. Lewis worried that what he called his best system account of laws might succumb to a certain disease. He called the disease rat bag idealism. Anybody know that phrase, rat bag idealism? When I first encountered it, I wondered, what is going that be, rat bag idealism? I first thought it must be, rat bag must refer to a bag that rat catchers carry around, which they put rats in. No, maybe it's a bag that rats carry around. No, I asked Michael Strevens, who said he couldn't be here because he had someplace else to go. He's from New Zealand, where this phrase originates, and it just means really bad. Okay. So this is a malady, rat bag idealism, that strikes a philosophical view when it suffers from insufficient realism or relativism. Lewis is concerned that some might think that his best system account suffers from rat bag idealism, since what it counts as the world's best systematization and so laws depend on criteria that human scientists have devised. Lewis identified this as simplicity, informativeness, and fit, but he only specified these vaguely, and with different understandings and adding different criteria as suggestion science adds, maybe different laws would count, maybe different generalizations would count as laws. And the PDA seems even more susceptible to this disease, because according to it, which properties or quantities are scientifically fundamental also depends on humanly devised scientific criteria. And in fact, they also depend on the macroscopic language with which science begins, and that depends on human history and psychology. This seems to make which properties and entities are scientifically fundamental building blocks of the world, at least to an extent, depend on scientific practice and on history and psychology. But I think rat bag idealism and relativism are bogeymen. I wasn't scared by anything like I saw on Halloween. I don't have time to show you pictures of. I have grandchildren now. Can you believe that? They got dressed up on Halloween. I can show you pictures. They tried to look scary. But rat bag idealism was here in this context. They don't scare me. I don't think we have any reason to fear them for the PDA or BSA. The first thing to observe is that the PDA is completely compatible with what's usually called scientific realism, which is understood as the view that science aims to construct theories about the world, including unobservable parts about the world, and is sometimes successful in finding true or approximately true theories. The PDA is completely compatible with that. The PDA, of course, is not realist about the existence of non-Humean laws and so that Moreland likes, Chen Goldstein like, because it also wants to be realist about things that really exist, and it thinks that those things don't really exist. It's not realist about them. Both the BSA and the PS and the PDA are realist and not idealist about almost all truths. As realist as can be about almost all truths, since they hold that all truths, except those that specify or establish generalizations of laws, and the case of PDA, which predicates refer to scientific fundamental properties, are completely independent of scientific practice. They don't depend on scientific practice at all. But what does depend on scientific practice, it's which generalizations of laws and which predicates refer to scientific fundamental properties. These do depend on scientific practice. And so this may get one a bit worried. But I claim that this is not problematic, since the non-nomological and non-fundamental truths, they played the biggest role I dare say, but I won't say. I won't say what role they play. They play a big role. They play a big role in determining which are the fundamental predicates and which are the generalizations and the laws. Because what's being systematized. The role played by human history and psychology and scientific criteria and so on, what they're doing is they're systematizing those. Now, of course, if there were, you can imagine, as some people in this room have, alien scientists who have very, very different criteria or something like that, maybe they would come up with a very, very different account of what the laws of the world are. But I don't think that this is the case. I think really arguing this in detail can't be done in 5 minutes. But I think we know enough about our world now to know that if we were to ever encounter aliens and we recognize them via radical translation or however we go about doing it, as doing something like science, I'm pretty confident that there's a good vein of arguments, and I'm trying to write a paper about this now, that the view about the world that they would come up with is very, very similar to the optimal theory of our world. I'm not saying it'll be exactly like our world. The theory of our world, maybe quantum mechanics will be replaced by something later, but it'll include quantum mechanics for sure in some way. And I think any aliens will come up with would like that. Now, I'm just making this as a claim right now. If the claim is true, then the relativism and the PDA, the realism PDA is very, very restricted or limited. But I admit that I haven't filled in the details of that argument right now. So I want to know, end the paper just with one of the beautiful quote from Quine and saying how I think I brought Quine into this together. So, right before that, I just want to make sure everybody understands that while I've taken Quine's epistemology, I've turned it into a metaphysical view in the way we understand metaphysics about laws. That's what I think the contribution here is. Maybe it doesn't work, but that's what I think that I've done. Get the quote from Quine's.
It's on my handout. Do you want it?
It's on the handout anyway. Okay, I get it. I have it right here. Okay, so the quote is on the high handout, so you can look at it anyway, but just see why I'm quoting it, why I'm taking it. So here's the memorable passage from Quine. You read it on the handout. I lifted it right from Sanders' book, okay, because it was so beautiful. Now, I've seen other places where Quine says things like this, but this is taken from a particular place which was not so readily available. So
This is unpublished.
yes, I want to ask you more about that later, but he says things like this elsewhere, but it's a beautiful way I think he says it here. He says it's understandable that the philosopher should seek a transcendental vantage point outside the world that imprisons the natural scientist and mathematician. He would make himself an independent conceptual scheme, which is his task to study and revise. Give me, whose stone, a place to stand, Archimedes said, and I will move the world. Well, Quine is a pretty good stylist, but Archimedes, that was a stylist. However, Quine says, there is no such cosmic exile, as Sandra was saying earlier. The philosopher is in a position, rather, as Neurath says, of a mariner who must rebuild the ship in the open sea. So what I'm saying is that Lewis might not, even though he's Quine's student, might not have taken these remarks of Quine's to heart as much as he should have, in my view. His philosophy, metaphysics of plurality of concrete possible worlds looks to me like a transcendental vantage point from which one can survey all possible worlds. perfectly natural properties suggest a conceptual scheme more fundamental. And one that transcends the language of any science, of the language of science now, or maybe even the language of ideal science in the perfectly natural, in the theory of everything. Because the theory of everything that people come up with, it's fundamental scientific properties might not correspond to the perfectly natural properties of Lewis. Well, okay, so you see what I'm saying, right? Basically, what I think is that what Lewis did is he really sought a transcendental perspective outside of science from which to give an account of science. That's what his Humean account of science is. I liked the idea that law is systematized. I wanted to preserve that, but I wanted to bring it from within science, Quine's perspective. That what we're doing when we're doing philosophy is trying to come up with an account of the world from within science. It may go a little bit beyond science because we want an account of the world which shows us why science works and why it's successful and why we're very successful in coming up with an account of science. We are, but we don't really need to go outside. And when we go outside, we people our philosophy, fuse our philosophy also with, I think, notions that we don't really need in philosophy of science, like metaphysical necessity, metaphysical possibility, and perfect natural properties. So what I'm suggesting is that instead, this alternative view, which is the package deal account of laws, preserve systematization without perfect natural properties. Thanks.
Thanks, Barry. I'm wondering where this leaves you when it comes to the kind of nominalism versus realism issue that is exercising Lewis in work for theory of universals. So it seems a bit like one could be more of a kind of like a nominalist on your view than Lewis ends up having to
So
be.
as I understand nominalism, it really has to do with a view about abstract entities.
Oh, so I'm thinking about nominalism in the sense of nominalism about universals, right? So we just think of the natural properties as being classes of objects across possible worlds, and it's
I'm
just
not,
groups.
that's not part of I want a philosophy of science.
Yeah, so but I'm just wondering about the metaphysical. So Lewis seems to be committed to something a bit more than that once he starts talking about Humean supervenience, because the fundamental stuff is the qualities, right? So you kind of need an ontology of point size qualities that are instantiated in a point, whereas you don't need any of the qualities.
Right, I just have whatever the fundamental properties of science are. I don't know whether you want to call them qualities or not.
Right, okay, so okay, I think that was mine.
Okay, I thought you were going to ask a more difficult question, because Lewis makes use of natural properties in a lot of ways in his philosophy, in his theory of meaning, and proper deduction, and so on. Maybe someone else is going to ask about that, so I'm going to ask myself my questions. I don't know.
All right, but basically you're not interested.
No, I'm just not.
in
I'm not entering that.
We'll have a volunteer to ask Barry that question.
I'm used to thinking of the task of giving a complete account of laws of nature in terms of saying what the fundamental truths are and then saying how those truths explain the truths about laws. But I have the sense that that's not the right way to understand what you're doing in the PDA. So does that seem right? And if so,
I just didn't hear the very beginning of what you said. So Lewis does think that there's a Humean mosaic, and the laws are
certain entailments of the best systemization, optimal system, scientific systemization of the human mosaic. I think that there are macroscopic truths that science starts with and adds to as science develops. And that's what gets systematized.
Right, so one way of interpreting that, which I think is not the right way of interpreting you, is that instead of thinking of there being some human mosaic consisting of some micro-physical properties, you replace it with a mosaic of macroscopic.
Right,
I think that's not-
that's absolutely not the right way
Right,
to interpret it.
So then the question was, is there some other way of understanding what it means to give an account of laws of nature that does capture kind of what you're doing?
The laws of nature are entailments, certain entailments. I didn't say which, because not every entailment is going to count as a law, but entailments of the theory of everything of our world.
But is there some way of putting it in the form I'm used to, which is like, here are the fundamental truths and here's how they explain the
There
rest?
are going to
Or
be
is it-
fundamental truths on this account, because, or there might not be also. So that's also a possibility. But the way we think about it now, let's say, particle theory, standard model of quantum mechanics, there are fundamental truths. However, I mean, maybe I shouldn't even say anything about interpreting quantum mechanics, but there's a lot of different views. But there are but these are scientifically fundamental, and of course the laws will systematize them, and so they will play something like the role of the mosaic here. But the laws will be doing much more than that, and this is a point I didn't talk about because I realized I was going to go way over time. Is that on my account, this account applies to the special sciences as well as to the fundamental. So laws will be systematizing a lot. There'll be connections between, what you're going to say, what the connections are between special science laws, and so on. I can say something about that, and also a different account of naturalness will come out of this also, because of course the fundamental scientific properties will kind of play a role like natural properties, but also, seeing who you're sitting nearby, this fits in very well with a nomological account of naturalness, right? The properties of laws.
So, thanks, Barry. So like in other contexts, you're very happy to wear the badge of the mentaculous. So I would suggest that you own rat bag.
Not only do I wear the shirt, do you see my shirt? Is that a badge?
Sure. So
And it's not just one shirt.
you can have on the back, you have like rat bag idealists unite.
Yeah.
So here, I mean, one way of thinking about this is to, I mean, you can think of idealism as having two different dimensions. One is an idea of dependence, that sort of how things go depends on how we're thinking about it. And another is idea of a kind of flexibility across communities. But those can pull apart. Things might depend on our minds in ways that just don't turn out to be very flexible across communities. Even the aliens have to think about things this way. So maybe you don't have much flexibility across communities, given whatever you want to say about aliens that you can share here. But it seems like you still get real dependence on our minds. So I'm reminded of sort of Goodman's notion of entrenchment. Why do we prefer green over grew? And Goodman says, well, it's just because green is entrenched for us. That depends on us, and no metaphysical distinction. And it might be that green just happens to be entrenched for everyone, maybe even as a sort of like some like inbuilt, like maybe any alien
It would still
mind
depend
have
on
to-
us.
But it would still depend on us. So
Okay.
I think all of your notion of fundamental, it still depends on us and our practices and our thinking isn't rooted in the world. So in that sense, like, be a proud idealist.
I agree with that. Okay, but it's pretty limited. I agree, it depends on us, and I think it should be. Science is a creation of human beings. Notions like law and fundamentality are created by humans. So you wouldn't be shocked that what's fundamental depends on us. What laws are depends on us. And so we're together on this?
Oh, no, I mean. I
Lewis, I have to get it with you another way, my view is.
I think the world's out there independent of us and has its
No,
laws.
but I think that too. I do think the metaphysics that
You
goes.
think it's dependent on us?
No,
Might not
no,
like some,
understand what I'm saying here.
But it's dependent on us.
What's fundamental, what parts of fundamental depends on us, scientifically fundamental. But-
I'm a realist about that. I don't think it depends on us, but that's
But
okay.
you-
if you
about
are.
that,
If you have
Okay,
a
but
different
here's,
view.
okay, I didn't,
I didn't ask you to own the view. that it
let me
depends on
suggest
us.
this. Here's the metaphysics that goes along with my view. What the world is, and this, you'll like this part, Jonathan. The world is a one.
You don't have to say anything.
It's a unified whole, which has many, many different structures. Those are what our languages do, or our representations or whatever. It picks up structure, it's made true by the structures the world has. What we do is find the structures that fits the goals that we have for things like science. Maybe there are other projects that human beings or things like aliens might engage in, which play some other role, but not science. But science has certain goals the way it is now, of systematizing in a way that satisfies certain criteria that we've developed over the history of science. Those are some criteria that we've developed, and they will determine what's scientifically fundamental. But the truths, except those about what's fundamental and which generalizations of laws, those are completely mind independent. So it's not idealist in the way crazy idealists, if there are any such. Okay, we on the same page here? See why I disagreed a little bit about what you were saying?
As soon as you said the modus part, it's just happening.
Okay.
This is just a finger on this?
This is our first finger.
Which
I mean-
which finger?
Just to try to make sure I'm understanding the relationship between you two correctly. I think Barry thinks that there are complete mind independent facts. Even if the mind dependent facts are flexible, there are completely mind independent facts about which propositions are true. Which of those propositions are laws?
Which don't have the word
That's right.
fundamental or law.
Which of those are laws? Which of the terms in those propositions are fundamental and which are not? That's mind dependent, although he hopes in an inflexible way. But he thinks, am I getting you right here, Barry?
Oh, you got me exactly right.
Okay, but there is this,
you do.
there is this big domain of just propositions, forgetting about whether we label them as law-like or not, which I think whose truth or falsehood, I think Barry thinks doesn't even have an inflexible sort of mind.
It's as if there are how things are in themselves, and
Right.
then there's the world of experience that somehow its causal structure depends on our cognitive constitution. But there's no idealism.
Boy, they're using out some kind of con. You can get a lot of trouble.
But right, I mean, it's fair enough, right?
Good, so a lot of things, but I wanted to ask a little bit more about your rejection of metaphysical modality. And whether you think there's gonna be another notion in the vicinity that you're going to need. So you speak about entailment and like presumably it's part of the account of law, that the laws are the entailments of a certain system. Part of the notion of informativeness that statements that entail a lot of macroscopic truths or informative. So yeah, so I'm wondering about this notion of logical necessity. How is that different from like Lewis's? I mean, I know Lewis has like a certain metaphysics that he uses to account for metaphysical necessity, but you might have thought that's the notion that he was trying to get at, like a notion of logical necessity of like, the kind of thing that our concepts aim to mirror. Like we try to have concepts that don't let us construct representations that correspond to logically impossible scenarios and that do let us construct representations that correspond to logically possible scenarios. So I'm thinking that many metaphysicians would think that you're on board with metaphysical necessity just by virtue of.
Well, maybe this phrase metaphysical necessity is a little bit of discussion. Earlier,
I was trying, when Sandra was talking, I was trying to see to what extent Quine makes it appear sometimes as though everything could go, everything is up for grabs. And I don't see that. I think that there's a notion of logical necessity that I understand pretty well. I imagine around the edges, I can imagine some changes in mathematics or logic or something like that, but maybe that's my imagination. When it comes to metaphysics, metaphysical necessity has taken on a life of its own when you read the literature in metaphysics now. So that all sorts of things are said to be metaphysically necessary that aren't parts of logic at all. They're very far from logic.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But then would you think that the notion of logical necessity, which you could think of as like a very minimal kind of metaphysical necessity, is that mind independent in Jonathan's sense? Or is that also tied up with our conceptual scheme?
It's a great question. It's a deep question. I don't have a deep answer. It's a really good question. But I mean, a lot of people think about that question, right? I mean, I guess, there's some sort of psychological or biological story to tell about why we have the categories, think about things, but I can't say much more than that. Now, of course, we think it's not merely that. We think it's some ways we think about it, but that gives the framework which we think about things. But I don't know. But I do want to separate myself from metaphysical possible necessity. I was reading a lot of stuff, which I'm sure you've read too, because around Rutgers, where people use the notion of metaphysical necessity and they talk about essential properties and stuff like that. Lewis didn't like essential properties much, but many others did. And it's become a big industry to talk about metaphysical necessity. I don't think that has much to do with logic. And that's the notion that I don't think needs to play a role in philosophy of science.
Right in the back. Oh, okay. Isaac.
Thanks, very really interesting as always. So I wanted to ask about the propositions that David brought up. So I want to know like what's in them. What would your characterization of what's in those propositions be? What they're about be?
Which propositions?
The ones that on your view, as I was understanding David's way of putting it, there's all these propositions that are true, that sort of are what's going on in the world, and then science comes along and kind of provides a certain sort of systematization, cuts the propositions up in certain ways. Like there's a certain sort of object, electron, and this proposition, like that's scientifically fundamental, starts using notions like fundamental dependence. And in the background of my mind, I'm thinking, well, there's a bunch of propositions that you don't want to have there that a certain sort of gung-ho metaphysician would have had there, like the dependence propositions that John like the parts depend on the whole. You don't want you want any sort of like metaphysically oomphy sounding thing. Necessity, you don't want those in these propositions to begin with. You want those sort of put there by the best package systematization process, as I'm understanding it. And so I just want to say, like, so totally, let's grant that. And then I'm just wondering, what is in the proposition? What are they in fact about?
This is how I understood your question at the beginning, and I do think there's an issue for me that somebody might get worried that there's no separating this is what I thought you were asking.
That's the background.
It's the background, okay. Okay, so, but here's how I'm thinking about it, and why I hope that this is not gonna be a word. We start speaking our language, we start working from within, start our language talking about projectiles and pendulum, planets, stuff like that. Now, maybe when we think about these things, we will decide that what it is to be a projectile is you couldn't be a projectile unless you're shot out by something. So maybe there's some sort of a necessity involved in that, but that's not something that's fundamental. So we'll be able to explain that in terms of notions like analyticity. Well, I'm not rejecting that. So, okay, but just the meaning of the word projectile,
so on. So we're starting up with our ordinary language. And we're systematizing that. We're adding more to that and more to that and more to that until we come up with the best systematization in the world. Now, maybe metaphysicians will come along and they'll say, but among the things we want to talk about are wholes and their parts. And we do ordinarily talk about that too. And now, is a worry now that somehow that's going to be a problem here? I don't know.
So the word is just like, so Lewis's collection of propositions would talk about, let's see, fundamental particles and categorical properties. And I was understanding your propositions to talk about macro stuff only.
That's where we're starting. But a
That's,
lot gets added to it.
so,
That's just the start.
so the propositions talk about.
But these, understand it, and maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, these are not fundamental, these are.
I know.
These are epistemically where we start, but they're not fundamental.
Right.
Scientifically,
They're
and there's
just-
nothing metaphysically fundamental other than this little story I told about structural stuff before.
So the propositions that David was talking about, those propositions are about things like tables and chairs. Okay. But then I'm thinking the place I would find it kind of concerned with your view is there's dependencies among that stuff as well. Like macro dependency is a very familiar phenomenon.
I mean, they depend on the atoms that they're made up of.
No, I mean like, it's just all over, like does the chair depend on the wheels or the wheels on the chair? Nothing about atoms. I mean, just
Chairs
You know,
are made up out of
when I
wheels.
will arrive.
I mean,
at the
chairs are
train
made
station
up out of
depends on the
wheels,
time
chairs
of
are
the
made out
trains.
of arms and wheels and so on.
Yeah,
I
there's
agree,
that.
of course.
Yeah. So then we've got a dependency relation in the propositions. The propositions that you're starting with are about, among other things, the kind of what I would, well, I don't call it a dependency.
I don't mind that at all. That's fine, as long as these are ultimately explicable, as those are scientifically, as they certainly are.
Okay, we should keep.
I mean,
Exactly.
is it, do you see, no, I'm a little bit,
I don't, I guess, I mean, I think the reason.
there's no deep metaphysical issue about how the chair is made up out of these arms and the wheels and the seat and so on. They're just put together.
The macro truths that your PDA is systematizing, I'm thinking are gonna already include a bunch of the metaphysical stuff you don't like.
Why do you say it's metaphysical?
I'm thinking the dependence relation, whatever it is between the chair and its parts. Yeah, so I'm thinking of that as like gonna be a metaphysical dependency relation. I guess you could just think there are none of them, but I'm just thinking.
I don't think that's a metaphysical relation.
Yeah.
That's where maybe you can convince me that's not right.
Like I gotta make the train on time. That's a kind of necessity. I mean, it's not necessarily
Well,
metaphysical necessity, there's tons of necessity all around us.
I agree that usually I don't, usually I'm late, but of course I don't want to get rid of
It's not
talking like
reflexive.
that. But we probably,
I gotta make it, but I didn't.
but we perfectly can make sense of talking without going into notions of metaphysical necessity.
But if those items of reality are in your starting bag of propositions that Dave was talking about, then I'm worried you haven't done what it sounds like you're claiming you've done. Because you started with the sort of things that you wanted to explicate in terms of science.
I've started with it epistemologically, but I've explicated it in terms of the scientific theory of the world. They're not fundamental in the account of the world. It's just where science starts, and it's what gets systematized. Part of systematizing it is ultimately explicating it in terms of what science is.
But are the propositions epistemological?
Propositions of things. Do I have to use the word proposition?
Well, I was trying to, that was my way into your view with David's interpretation. Just,
Yeah, I mean, these are, well, look, there's the claims about that we start with. We start with those, I said epistemological, so it's my fault, but that's where we start. We wake up, we open our eyes and say, wow, the sky is blue, the grass is green. I wonder how they're related to each other. Let's be scientists.
thanks.
Thanks, Barry. So this is related to the question I asked you at first, but the thought was,
I didn't read the part of the paper, which is an answer to your question.
oh. Okay, so maybe this will give you an opportunity to say. But so my thought was throughout philosophy, not just science, we talk about what reduces to what, what's fundamental, etc. So here are 3 examples. Philosophy of mind, our phenomenal properties, consciousness fundamental. Imagine a property dualist saying they're fundamental, physicalist saying not. And I can imagine they agree on everything else, so they can agree on causal closure, they can agree there's no immaterial immortal soul or something. They only disagree about whether phenomenal properties are fundamental. Property dualist says yes, physicalist says no. Take meta-ethics, there's a non-naturalist in meta-ethics who think all properties are fundamental. Other people think they're not, but they can agree about everything else. So you can imagine 2 utilitarians, they agree on what you should do, all the ethical facts. They just disagree about whether goodness is fundamental or whether it's usable. Or take a philosophy of math or other abstract entities. You might have people who both agree that there are abstract objects, but one of them says they're fundamental entities, and the other one says no, they're not fundamental entities. So it seems like all over philosophy, there's discussions about what's fundamental, what reduces to what, and you can imagine views that agree on everything except whether morality is fundamental, whether consciousness is fundamental, whether abstract are fundamental. And do you think all those debates are up to us and not objective?
I'm doing philosophy of science. If that's what you want to do
But
it.
does your view have implications for those debates? Like this, because they're all about
Well, let's say about the content, some of the ones you talked about, I really don't know what to say about. About the consciousness one is one I've thought about, and I do have something to say about, I think. About that, if you try to come up with a scientific view of the world, maybe you can come up with a scientific view of the world in which you could find a place for consciousness within the scientific view of the world. If you can't, you might end up being one of these so-called illusionists. I think the real illusion there is to think that a scientific account of the world has to have something that is a reduction of properties like consciousness in the way that people like Chalmers think they have to be. Why is it Lewis? You can't get it. I don't think there's got to be such, because we have a scientific account of how we think about our consciousness, so that we see once we think about things like that, our own conscious states like that, we realize we'll never get that kind of account. You know what I'm alluding to, right? Yeah. I'm saying that. Okay, many people are right now, but so I do think that a scientific account of the world can accommodate that in a way in which consciousness will turn out to be fundamental scientifically, but of course, epistemologically, nothing could be more.
So are you okay with objective metaphysical fundamentality outside science? Are you okay with objective metaphysical fundamentality outside science?
I don't know. That's up to you guys. You know, down the road where they get a lot of money at Princeton for stuff, you can deal with problems like that. I don't know. Really, you know, if you want to think about fundamentality like that, great. I don't think in philosophy of science you got it like that.
Sorry.
Thanks. So I agree that PDA is a lot more Quinian than Sika. But the conclusion of your paper puts you on the immanent side and Lewis on the transcendental side.
Right.
And this is, of course, a categorical distinction. You cannot be a bit more transcendental than. And I always like the interpretation of what Lewis is doing that Tim Williamson gives, basically saying what Lewis took Quine's.
I went swimming yesterday. My ears are still full of water.
Yeah. So basically, the idea is that Lewis just took Quine's methodology and realized, well,
Yes,
we
I think of that one.
yeah, we just encounter puzzles like the new riddle of induction. We encounter modal notions in starting in the middle, and so we build an account that does best. And Lewis, to basically having a Quinian program that much more liberal. But that would put Lewis also on the immanent side. But Lewis seems to be really convinced that he does presupposes transcendental vantage point, and I don't see why we should interpret Lewis in this way. based on this talk.
Right. There's a really good question, because I'm worried about whether I went a little too far. I said that, but I wrote that. The reason I was saying is this. The Quine says about the transcendental point of view is that it imagines some language outside of science to which science is compared. That's what I think perfectly natural properties are. And one reason to think about it like that involves one of the objections made by Bas van Fraassen to Lewis's account of the laws, where van Fraassen said that, look, suppose that scientists came up with a theory of everything that looked great. It did everything that we wanted. Okay. But in fact, the fundamental predicates don't refer to perfectly natural properties. Then it wouldn't have the laws according to Lewis's account. Now, there's a reply that Lewis might make to that. One long conversation I had with Lewis is the reply he did make to me about that, and I bet you can guess what it is. I'm sure that people in the room could guess what it would be.
It wouldn't be a guess.
What?
It wouldn't be a guess.
Wouldn't be a guess. No, he may. Does he actually publish it anyways?
No, but you told me what they were.
Oh, I is that he uses perfectly natural properties as a kind of reference. And so he said, although he wasn't sure in the conversation I had with him about this, and I couldn't quite tell, because I didn't know Lewis very well, but when you talked to him, he wasn't quite sure whether he was talking to you or not. But I didn't know whether he was thinking about this, he had thought of this too deeply before or not. I wouldn't be surprised if he had. But his idea was that, well, in a theory of everything, the perfectly natural properties would, by reference magnetism, have to refer to in theory of everything, the scientifically fundamental properties, by reference magnetism, would have to refer to the perfectly natural properties. That could be a reply that he'd give. That depends on buying his theory of reference magnetism, and it's very much contentious. There are a lot of arguments about it with the other, and a bunch of other issues. But maybe that would get around it. But if you didn't buy that, would you see why I think this is a transcendental perspective?
So
I went a little bit to the side. I wouldn't just answer your question.
Yeah.
I think that the language of perfectly natural properties is a language, could be a language outside of science. And it's the perspective that the gods would see the world.
So let me ask the question in a different way. So Quine, in his wildest metaphysical period, was toying with this idea that there's just numbers and hyper-Pythagoreanism, metaphysical objects. I think that if he would have ended up with that position, he does not, but if he had ended up with it, then you could have given the same argument, basically saying Quine's now at a point that he has this transcendental advantage.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that wouldn't be correct, because it would still be an attempt to work from within and come up with the simplest, most explanatory way to organize a conceptual scheme. I think that's the same can be done for this.
I see. The reason I'm not going along with you is that the role that perfectly natural properties plays for Lewis is that it's out there to which science, his view is that science ought to look out for them. It's not like they've somehow been generated from within science. My view is that the fundamental properties are generated from within science. You see why there's a little bit of a difference there. This is this Plato Euthyphro.
Yeah, that's a really nice metaphor.
So David has different motivations in New York for theory of universals for introducing distinctions.
Speak loudly.
So Lewis has in new work a variety of motivations for introducing the distinction.
Right.
One of them is to give purchase to the thesis of materialism as a supervenience thesis. And he thinks he needs to by his lights, deal with the following objection to some ways of doing it. It's not enough to say that two worlds that are alike, say physically, are alike simpliciter, because he thinks that's false, right? He thinks you could have a world that physically duplicates ours, but is populated by spooks. And so what he does is restrict, says like, well, within worlds that share the actual world's inventory of perfectly natural properties, the supervenience thesis holds. So how would, so on your view, that way of defining materialism, or we could say physicalism too, is not available. Right.
Right.
So what way is available?
For me, I'm a physicalist if the best scientific theory of the world has in its ontology nothing beyond the physical. Now, I do have to say
So
something
that
about
would
the
be
physical.
true if the best scientific theory of the world was pretty bad. It didn't have anything to do with, like, didn't have anything to say about humans and how they behave.
What's not going to be the best scientific theory?
Well, you don't know. I mean, you said the best.
I do know. I do know. I do know because we've done much better already,
Well,
haven't we?
Okay, but then the thesis of physicalism isn't just the thesis you gave, it's also plus a prediction about how good our best theory will be.
So one thing that philosophers often try to do is they try to give a theory about things that hold under all possible worlds. I'm not into that. Okay, so I'm not doing that. I want an account of what science is doing that gives me an account of what laws are from within science. I don't want to account of what laws are in every possible world. I'm not even sure.
Gary, I wasn't asking for that, I was just
What?
asking like, how on your view should we understand physicalism?
That's the way I said. Physicalism will turn out to be true is if the best scientific theory of our world, and I don't know whether it'll be true or not, because it might very well be that spooks have to be introduced, the things that we think of as non-physical.
But again, like if we get unlucky and it turns out, physicists trying to square general relativity and quantum mechanics and they just can't, and then they discover new phenomena that they can't make good sense of, and the whole enterprise peters out. But we still have the best theory we're available, we can get. It just doesn't live up to your current aspirations. Then physicalism comes out true by default.
Well, wait, I'm not sure exactly.
Because
That
the
might
best
be,
scientific
but
theory
maybe
is
that's not so bad. But I'm not sure I understood that. So suppose the best theory we come up with is what Sean Carroll calls the core theory. No, I think that's physical. Okay. Is that okay?
Well, you have to say something more, because the dualist might think like, yeah, the reason physics petered out is because of consciousness.
Well, I think there's more to be said about why the core theory can incorporate consciousness. That's some philosophical work,
Okay.
and that I think that work is
But
done.
that's what I was pressing you for, because your official statement of physicalism did not include anything about like what our core theories are capable of explaining with regard to.
Well, the best scientific theory of the world has got to accommodate to the best it can everything in the world, and that will include, of course, the most obvious things like consciousness.
Did you want to get on this?
Simple thing that basic physical theories can be in some sense very simple, but when you make a large agglomeration of things, they can behave following those basic principles in ways which are completely unpredictable.
Sure, they are.
Yeah, so
The world is full of complexity.
I think that I know nothing about what you guys are talking about. But it seems like, there's all sorts of things which you can't possibly know trying to become a decision. Not good,
But why do you think that conflicts with anything I said?
no, I don't think it conflicts with
But I agree with you completely. There are a lot of things, human beings they never come up with the optimalist theory of the world, first of all. I am supposing that there is something like an optimal theory of the world, or maybe there's more than one optimal theory of the world. So that is a supposition of the package deal account. If that's not right, then the package deal account fails. And maybe that's what Ned was pressing me. Sure. So, and I maybe should.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what Ned's, I'm not I think, I mean, maybe Ned has a hidden agenda which will emerge if you grant this, but
That wouldn't be
it feels like,
surprising,
it
would
feels like Ned's just saying so far, you must also mean that the optimal theory of our world doesn't turn out to be terrible.
And also not panpsychist.
Right.
If physical.
And that seems, yeah, and that, for
Right, but how are you ruling that out?
True.
and
It
it
might
doesn't
be-
sound
might
like
be
it would
panpsychic.
cost you that much on the face of it.
It might be
Grant.
psychic. I'm not, I wasn't being committed to physicalism. I was being committed to PDA. Ned wanted to know what it would be, on my view, for physicalism to be true.
No,
Yeah.
Barry, I just want to know what the thesis of physicalism, how
Right.
it is properly stated.
Right.
under. That's
That
what
the
I want.
best theory of our world has at its fundamental ontology nothing more than the.
Not independent of how bad that theory is. Suppose that the best theory of our world is terrible.
Oh, I mean, like in some other world, which is a total mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Then maybe, I don't know what to say about those
Okay,
worlds.
okay.
I really, like I said, this is not a theory for all possible worlds.
okay, I mean, I think that's all Ned was asking.
That is the perfect place to end.
Because we're really hungry, right?
Yes, it's 1:59. We're gonna be out the door too. So,
Mhm.
thanks very much, Greg.